The word is neoconservatism. Neoconservatism. The word neoconservatism literally means new conservative, neo being the Greek word for new and conservatism meaning politically on the right. And this was a term that was given to American political activists in the early 1970s, and these were former leftists, in some cases former communists, and also former members of the Democratic Party. And gradually their political views evolved. They moved rightwards, they were increasingly conservative, they left socialism behind, they left the Democratic Party behind, and they were given the name neoconservatives, meaning new conservatives, because they were new to conservatism and new to the Republican Party in the US. It was meant to be an insult, really. It was meant to be a derogatory term, and it was given to them by their former comrades on the left who were basically saying, well, you've moved so far to the right, you're basically now conservatives, you're like new conservatives, neoconservatism. So the neocons actually really embraced this term, as they took it as a kind of a badge of honour, really, and began to refer to themselves as neoconservatives, or neocons for short, and the name really stuck with them. Some of them went on to serve in the Reagan administration, and they mainly had second and third tier positions in Reagan's administration, but this is how they really solidified their influence in the Republican Party. Although ultimately they broke with Reagan, they were quite disappointed with elements of his foreign policy in particular, especially the way that he dealt with the Soviet Union. They felt that he was much too soft with the Soviet Union. The neocons were much more hardline. But then in 1989, the Cold War ended anyway, and the Cold War had really fired a lot of these neocons, and the end of the Cold War really kind of split the neocon movement. It really lost its focus, and there was a new, younger generation that came through. And those neocons were out of office in the 1990s and were great opponents of Bill Clinton. In particular, they thought he was very soft when it came to foreign policy. So this second generation of neocons, they were very interested in the problems of the post-Cold War world. And they really believed that with the demise of the Soviet Union, America was now the single pole of power in the world. A very famous neocon columnist called Charles Krauthammer coined this phrase, the unipolar moment. And he said that 1989 was America's unipolar moment because it was now the single pole of power in the world. It was the world's only superpower. There was no longer a Soviet Union to compete with the United States. So the neocons believed that American foreign policy should be dedicated to preserving and extending this unipolar moment as far into the future as possible. They lobbied the Clinton administration on a number of issues, such as national missile defense, but the really key issue for them, the one that they really made their signature issue, if you like, was regime change in Iraq. They believed very strongly that Saddam Hussein had to go because he was basically challenging American power in the Middle East. This was a region that was extremely important because of its energy reserves, for geopolitical reasons, and so it was a region that the neocons wanted America to dominate. They didn't want Saddam Hussein to dominate that region, and they believed that he had to go. In many respects, I think their message kind of fell on fertile ground because they had a lot of sympathy in Congress. And in fact, in 1998, Congress adopted the Iraq Liberation Act, which made it official US government policy to pursue regime change in Iraq. And the neocons played quite an important role, I think, in putting this issue on the agenda in the 1990s. While they were out of office, the neocons were really kind of positioning themselves for a return to office should the Republican Party win the presidential election in 2000. And of course, George W. Bush did win that election. When he was looking to appoint people to staff his administration, he turned to many of those neocons who'd been active during the 1990s. People like Paul Wolfowitz, who was the second highest official in the Department of Defense, Douglas Feith, who also had a very important policy-making role in the Department of Defense. The neocons mainly took on second and third tier positions in the Bush administration, but they were influential. They came to office with big ideas about what they wanted to do, what they thought the purpose of American foreign policy should be, this idea of preserving America's position as the unipolar power, the single pole of power in the world. And this is something that George W. Bush was very responsive to, particularly after 9/11. 9/11 was very much the pretext for the Bush administration to implement some of these pre-existing policy preferences. Just a few hours after 9/11, we now know that Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense, was already asking his advisors to think about how America could use this as an opportunity to not just deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also to think beyond that, to think more broadly and think about how the US could link Saddam Hussein to these events and pursue regime change in Iraq. And the neocons were very important in lobbying for this policy in the US government in the aftermath of 9/11, and also in terms of their involvement in manipulating intelligence so that it appeared to support this policy of pursuing regime change in Iraq. The neocons had always, even back to the 1990s, very much promoted the idea that an American invasion would be welcome in Iraq, that the Americans would be welcomed as liberators because they would be getting rid of this tyrant, Saddam Hussein. The neocons really encouraged the Bush administration to think that the invasion, I suppose, would be easy. They believed that there would be no need for a large American presence in Iraq after the war. They believed that the Iraqi opposition group, the Iraqi National Congress, would be able to set up a democratic government relatively easily, and that democracy would flower in Iraq. And this was one of the reasons why the Bush administration did not do a particularly great job of planning for the aftermath of the invasion in Iraq. They did not believe that the Americans and the British and the other countries who also supported the invasion, they didn't believe that they would be seen as occupiers. And the problem, of course, was that they were seen as occupiers and their presence was very much resented. And this was the reason why an insurgency developed quite quickly, really within a year of the invasion. And the war obviously carried on for almost a decade. Neocons were very much blamed for the insurgency and all of the problems that came about as a result of that. Neoconservatism, it does still exist, but it's very much merged into mainstream American conservatism and the Republican Party as well. And in general, neocons, I think, can be identified by the fact that they believe in an aggressive American foreign policy, but there's no single unifying issue that unites them now in the way that they used to be before the invasion of Iraq. So they're very much part of the mainstream Republican Party now.